This video will go over the worst cards which have once per duel effects. Usually a restriction added to good effects that Konami really doesn't want you to abuse. And at number 10, we have Performapal Splashmammoth. As a level 6 pendulum monster with terrible scales at 4, its monster effect on the field is, during your main phase, you can fusion summon a dragon-type fusion monster from your extra deck, using monsters you control as the fusion materials. And you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, this is like a really crappy version of Fusion Substitute, a restricted version of Polymerization, because at least Poly lets you use cards in your hand as well. This is only monsters you control in the field, and only for dragon-type fusion monsters. It's just incredibly restrictive on top of having a once per duel effect. There's another card called Luna Light Wolf, who has an effect on its pendulum scale that once per turn you can use materials on your field or your graveyard for a fusion summon of a Luna Light monster, which is basically a miracle fusion, which is a great card and is only once per turn, not once per duel. Way better than a crappy fusion substitute that's only once per duel. But I will have to say this, the fact that this card itself can be used for the fusion summon and it will go to the extra deck, it's not really fair to compare a monster with this kind of effect to a spell card, which is generally a little bit better for monsters that have these kinds of effects. But you still kind of get the gist of it. Even if it is a monster card, it's still not very good. And at number 9, we have Exchange of the Spirit. This card has the effect where both players have 15 or more cards in their graveyard. You can pay 1,000 life points to swap the cards in the graveyard with their deck. And you can only use this effect once per duel. So it can be a way to make sure your opponent has 15 cards in their deck exactly, if they've already gone through 15 cards that they put in the graveyard. And with the average deck having about 20 cards left after that much of a mill, you're not really gaining much from the Exchange of Spirit mill. Its effect is pretty incredibly situationally useful, but I can't really think of a situation in which it's useful off the top of my head. I'm sure there is one though. Anyways, this is an errata card, whose old effect was so powerful that the card was on the ban list for the longest time. And the only difference between its errata version and its current version is the once per duel effect, and the fact that your opponent didn't need to have 15 cards in their graveyard. Only you did. So if you got 15 cards into your graveyard, and you use this card to swap your deck with your graveyard, your opponent would also have to swap their deck with their graveyard, and since they wouldn't have a graveyard, they would just send their entire deck to the graveyard and be completely milled out with one card, which was super good, and part of one of the most consistent decks you can make if you use banned cards. So with the correction, or errata, of requiring both players to have 15 cards in their graveyard, it completely destroyed the viability of this card of instantly milling your opponent. And then they slapped on a once per duel effect just to be extra sure no one would use it. And at number 8, we have Condemned Maiden. This card has the effect where during your opponent's turn, you can activate one quick play spell card from your hand, and you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, this effect in itself isn't half bad, I guess. Not having to set a quick play spell card and instead being able to activate it from your hand during your opponent's turn is actually pretty good. Except for a few things. Quick play spell cards can already be activated during your opponent's turn, so you don't gain much from being able to activate one from your hand. And also, this card has 100 attack, so if you normal summon this card in order to be able to use its quick play from your hand effect, it would just be an open target for your opponent to beat over it with basically anything. So while its effect is technically kind of useful, it's not useful enough for its one per duel clause and its really bad attack point value. Although, to be fair, if this card had the effect where you could just use any quick play spell card from your hand at all times without the once per duel clause, this card would be really good. And I think this is just kind of a case of them trying to overbalance the effect. And that's why it has so many downsides, like terrible stats and once per duel clauses. And at number 7, we have Rank Up Magic the 7th one. Now, the effect of this card is actually really good. It allows you to special summon a number monster from your extra deck between numbers 101 and 107, and then immediately you can rank it up with its appropriate rank up number C card, without using any other monsters as materials. The problem with this card is really its activation requirement. The only way to actually use this card is to draw it during your draw phase, reveal it, and then use it first thing during your turn. So you either have to just get really lucky and draw it during the course of a duel, or stack your deck so that you can draw it from the top of your deck on your next turn. And on top of its hard to pull off activation requirement, it also has a once per duel effect, so you couldn't make a deck that tries to revolve around this card to be consistent. I think this is another case of them just trying to balance its effect that they thought would be too good by just slapping on a once per duel clause. And at number 6 we have Limit Code. This card actually has a pretty decently strong effect. If you have Cyberse Link monsters in your graveyard, you can place 1 counter on this card for each of those monsters, and then you can special summon 1 Code Talker monster from your extra deck and equip it with this card. So, it allows you to straight up special summon a Link monster straight from your extra deck, and some of the Code Talkers are pretty good. So off the bat, pretty decent effect. And it also has the effect of, if this card leaves the field, the monster it's equipped to is destroyed, and during each of your end phases, you need to remove 1 counter from this card, or this card is destroyed. And you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, the effect itself is good. It's everything else about it that really restricts it. You might see a trend here. A lot of these once per duel effects technically have good effects, but then they try really hard to balance the card so that it's not too overpowered. And this card kind of falls into that category as well. First of all, it's a trap card, which already makes it pretty slow, and is a huge detriment to its power. Honestly, with its once per duel clause, they could have easily just made it an equipped spell card. Second of all, you need to have your graveyard set up already. So you've already eliminated the fact that this card could be used as a combo extender, as you really want all of those to be usable on your first or second turn. And this card first needs to be set on the field for a turn, and you need to have your graveyard set up in order to use it. And on top of all that, it has a maintenance cost. And to 100% make sure no one will ever abuse this card, they slapped on the once per duel effect. If this card didn't have a once per duel, I'm not sure people would really play it too much. But the fact that you can only use one of them definitely made sure of that. And at number 5, we have Tasuke Knight. This is a monster with a graveyard effect, where if an opponent's monster attacks and you have no cards in your hand, you can special summon this card from the graveyard and end the battle phase. That's a pretty decent effect, and you get a monster on the field and you get to end the battle phase. The problem with this card though is its restrictions. You need to have no cards in your hand, which is a pretty big restriction for most decks, besides very few select ones that don't want to have a hand. And there's also another card called the Electromagnetic Turtle, which has an incredibly similar effect, where you can banish it from the graveyard and end the battle phase. And it's also once per duel, which that card doesn't see very much play either. And if the easier version to use, which is much better, rarely sees use, this card is kind of like a lesser version of Electromagnetic Turtle, and that's the reason I have it on a high spot on this list. And at number 4, we have Blackwing Hillen the Tengu-wind. This is a level 5 Blackwing tuner, which has the effect where if this card and a level 3 or lower Blackwing monster is in your graveyard, and your opponent attacks you directly, and you take more than 2,000 points of battle damage from that attack, then you can special summon this card and that other Blackwing monster from your graveyard, and both of those cards' effects are negated. And you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, while the effect is pretty good, special summoning 2 cards from the graveyard, this one kind of falls into the Tasuke Knight category of requiring too much conditions for the effect to apply, while also having a once per duel effect on top of it all. Like, if you have cards which have incredibly convoluted activation requirements, or just unconventional ones, usually you don't want to slap once per duel effects on them as well, because usually people will have to build decks around that, and if they can only use an effect one time, they won't bother building a deck around that effect, unless that effect can literally just win you the game on its own, which neither of these cards can do. They just have decent effects that are too restrictive because Konami thought their effects would be too overpowered without those restrictions, which they probably would have been. These restrictions made this card kind of balanced, and balanced cards don't do very well. And at number 3, we have XYZ Agent. This is a level 2 monster, where if it's in the graveyard, you can just attach it to a Utopia Exceeds monster you control as one of its materials, and you can only use the effect once per duel. Now, Utopia Exceeds monsters don't really use their materials very often, and this card was obviously made for a Utopia Protect the Castle deck, and those kinds of decks rarely actually use the Utopia effects that they have all their cards put on. And this card is also a level 2 monster, in a deck that's all about level 4 monsters where their levels absolutely matter. So it just straight up doesn't fit in the kind of deck that it was made for, as those decks also don't really have any mill potential. That's why it makes the number 3 spot on this list. And at number 2, we have Constellar Tempest. This is a Constellar continuous spell card, which has the effect where, during your end phase, if you control 2 Constellar Exceeds monsters that have Exceeds materials, you can detach all of those Exceeds materials from both of those Exceeds monsters, and if you do, you can cut your opponent's life points in half. So, Exceeds monsters must have their materials in order to use their effects, and you have to just give up all of them from those 2 monsters you control, when it's already difficult to get those 2 out on the field, especially in an archetype that usually only gets out 1 of them per turn anyway. All for the effect of just cutting your opponent's life points in half. Like, don't get me wrong, having your opponent's life points is a good effect. It's just Constellars don't really care about that. They're all about going into Exceeds monsters, not inflicting burn damage to your opponent. And this card completely goes against that by removing your ability to use those Exceeds monsters' effects. But having its second effect does contribute to it a little bit more, where its second effect is, during your standby phase, you can attach a Constellar monster from your graveyard to a Constellar Exceeds monster you control. Which is an okay effect, but isn't the best thing in the world because it only happens during your standby phase, which means you have to have a monster survive for an entire turn, and falls into the category of a win more effect. One that won't really help you win the game, but will help you win more if you're already ahead, which, basically means it's kind of useless. In addition to its once per duel effect, which isn't really that good anyway. Alright, and at number 1, we have Dai Dance. This card has the effect where you can choose 1 main monster zone your opponent controls, and your opponent must summon a monster to that zone if they wish to summon a monster. Which, sure, seems like kind of a niche effect to have, especially if you have a card pointed to that zone that activates when a monster is summoned to it, kinda like the topologic dragons. And this effect, of course, is once per duel. Now, here's the problem with this card. That's all it does. The only thing it does is force your opponent to summon a monster into a specific zone. That effect is situationally useful at best, but that's not anywhere near good enough to justify a once per duel trade-off. Because having your opponent summon a monster into one zone on its own isn't very useful. It requires setup with other cards to make it useful, and it's a trap, so you have to wait a turn in order to use it, and even then it's not even like a game-winning effect to have your opponent summon a monster into a specific zone. It's just kind of a neat thing that might activate some of your monster effects. This card squarely falls into the realm of gimmick cards, or incredibly situational useful cards, and really doesn't need a once per duel clause, which is why I think it's the worst card with a once per duel effect. Alright, and that's the video. Do you know of any other cards with once per duel effects that have bad effects? Because honestly, most of them have pretty decent effects. Giving them a once per duel clause is just there to kind of balance them out. And if you have ideas for videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.